Welcome to the conversation at airsafe.com. I'm your host, Todd Curtis. On July 7, 2017, an Air Canada A320, coming in for a landing at San Francisco's airport, nearly landed on an active taxiway with 4 airliners waiting to take off. Fortunately, the airliner executed a missed approach, and an accident was avoided. The following Tuesday, on July 11th, I was interviewed by radio station CJOB of Winnipeg, Canada about this event.
We want to talk about an accident that was avoided at the last possible moment at San Francisco International Airport. This near miss might have triggered, and this is in quotations, the greatest aviation disaster in history. Here's some audio on that from CBS.
It was just before midnight when other pilots sounded the alarm and possibly prevented a horrific accident. Air Canada Flight 759 with 140 people on board was coming in from Toronto. The Airbus A320 was cleared to land on runway 28 right at San Francisco International, but instead lined up for the taxiway that parallels the runway. There were 4 other airliners on that taxiway waiting to take off. Air traffic control audio captured what happened next.
Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759. We see some lights on the runway there. Across the runway, can you confirm the clear to land?
Air Canada 759 confirmed, clear to land, runway 28 right. There is no one on 28 right but you.
Okay, Air Canada 759.
Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway. Yeah, I saw that guy.
The FAA is now investigating the distance between that Air Canada flight and those jets on the ground on taxiway C. Air Canada says the airliner eventually landed safely, and the airline is also investigating what happened. Chris Van Cleve, CBS News, Washington.
What jumped out for me in that audio, Tristan?
Mm-hmm.
How calm, cool, and collected the air traffic controller remained.
Oh, yeah. In that circumstance, you can't even just show a little bit of panic because you start doing that and things get out of control quickly, especially when you're monitoring potentially hundreds of planes. I can only imagine.
Well, they say it's one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. Todd Curtis, AirSafe Foundation, formerly worked for Boeing and the American Air Force, joins us now. And Todd, just by all accounts, this was a tragedy that was very nearly unparalleled, in fact, in terms of scope.
Well, that's correct. There have been occasions in the past. One that comes to mind is in LAX some years ago, where an airliner accidentally landed on top of another airliner and killed several dozen people. But this was potentially something that could have involved up to 5 aircraft. That certainly would have put it in the range of being the most tragic accident in the history of aviation.
Todd, I have to ask, as someone who has next to no knowledge when it comes to how air traffic controlling works or how the process at an airport works, when a plane is about to land, what's the procedure in there to make sure that there are no crashes, especially when you have a busy airport like San Francisco International?
Well, that's one of the issues that I believe the FAA will definitely look into, because depending on the circumstances, even though this was a nighttime event, I believe the weather was relatively clear, and they may have been operating under largely visual flight rules. That is, instead of using the automated landing systems like the instrument landing system, that they were relying on essentially their eyeballs to figure out where they were and to align properly with the runway. And this may have been a case where they may have been confused by the lights on the ground and lined up with the taxiway, which is parallel to the runway, rather than the runway itself.
The taxiway parallel to the runway. I find that interesting that would be the case. Is that a usual circumstance, or are they typically perpendicular, Todd?
Well, it depends on the airport. Typically, if you have a fairly straightforward airport, let's say a single runway airport, you'll have a taxiway paralleling the runway, and also other taxiways going to and from the terminal. San Francisco has several major runways and several taxiways, some of which parallel the major runways. And I believe in this event, the 4 aircraft that were waiting were on a taxiway immediately parallel to the main runway.
Wow. I mean, I've been in and out of San Francisco a couple of different times. It's obviously an extremely busy airport. The geography is challenging, of course. It kind of juts out into San Francisco Bay, depending on, obviously, this flight was from Toronto. You come in over the mountains. They're not incredibly high mountains. It's no Hong Kong or anything like that. But it's got its challenges. And, of course, weather can often be a factor in San Francisco.
Yes, indeed. In fact, the weather could be a factor in a good way, in the sense of good weather could encourage pilots to operate in a way that's unsafe. And I say this because almost 4 years to the day before this near miss, there was a crash in San Francisco involving an Asiana 777 aircraft, which was on a spectacularly clear daylight visual landing sort of day, the kind of picture postcard weather that you would use to attract tourists to San Francisco. And the crew in that case, the NTSB did an investigation. The crew in that case was using automated landing systems in ways that were inappropriate for a landing when they were supposed to be using essentially a visual set of flight rules rather than an instrument set of flight rules.
Todd, I have to ask, and I don't know if we have this information, but how frequent roughly are incidents, do incidents like this take place? I mean, obviously the scope of this near hit, frankly, it was massive, but in terms of, almost having two aircraft almost crash at an airport, how often does that happen? I assume that gets rarer with better technology, but it must happen once in a while, eh?
That's an excellent question, and one that I'm actually ill-equipped to answer, because the databases that are widely available to the public that talk about incidents and accidents, if you have something that's a near miss, for example, an airplane almost lands on a taxiway but rejects the landing and lands normally later on, that may not show up in any database. Typically, when I do hear about this, it's through the media. You may remember a few months ago, I believe it was February this year, Harrison Ford, the movie actor and actually quite accomplished pilot, almost landed on the taxiway of an airport in Southern California. He got a lot of media play. There was even a video of his airplane nearly landing on the taxiway. The FAA didn't charge him or sanction him in any way. And just in preparation for this story, I found out about an event in 2015 at the Seattle airport where an airplane actually did land on the taxiway. Fortunately, there were no other aircraft there. And this was apparently the fourth time that it happened at SeaTac Airport. Yet it was something that would not show up in any official database that's easily accessible.
And Todd, can you confirm for me, because I have an article open right now that says that Harrison Ford did in fact land on the taxiway at John Wayne Airport. Was it a near miss, or did he in fact land on the taxiway?
I stand corrected. I remember looking at the video, and it only had a portion of the view. It showed him flying over, I believe it was a Southwest Airlines 737. He was about 30 or 40 feet distant from the aircraft.
Right.
But he didn't hit that aircraft. And as you said, I don't believe it was a rejected landing. So, yes, this sort of thing happens on a regular basis, but it's not something that necessarily will show up in something that can easily be compiled so you can say statistically, are things getting better or are things getting worse? One thing I will say without hesitation, what is getting better is the likelihood that you and I and the general public find out about these things much, much, much higher today. You not only have cameras at all major airports looking at routine landings and takeoffs, you have passengers and pilots and ground crew who may be witnesses with cameras in their pockets to take pictures of this. So where it may have happened in the past, it may have been swept under the rug. It's much harder to hide it now.
You know, I make the assimilation to Disneyland, and you see these traveling amusement park shows where they take up and put up rides for 3-4 days on a weekend, and they go somewhere else. And you know, so there's a perception that those rides are less safe than, say, permanent rides at Disneyland. I don't know the exact statistics, but I feel more comfortable on the rides at Disneyland, but that doesn't mean accidents don't happen there. They're just very good at making sure there isn't panic happening when they take place, and they've got infrastructure so that they can keep those from us much better than they would in a farmer's field or at the state or county fair.
And in a sense, there's a parallel between aviation and the amusement industry in that when something happens to an airliner, that's a very newsworthy item, very, very hard to hide that. But if something happens, a private airport, private airplane, away from the eyes of the public, it may happen and no one will know about it. Similarly, something happens at Disneyland, Disney World, Six Flags, or any major amusement park, it's national and sometimes international news. And there's a lot of pressure on that industry to get things right and to keep bad things from happening. Not so much pressure for the smaller operators who are operating almost in the shadows, so to speak.
Todd, I have to ask just your perspective on this as someone who has tremendous expertise in this area. I mean, if I may draw a comparison to traffic violations, for instance, if you get a speeding ticket or a parking ticket, that may not involve another vehicle, that may not involve anyone else, but the fact is those are tracked and those are monitored in spite of the fact that those are not crashes and those don't involve anybody else. Now, when it comes to these near misses with these airplanes, I would think, just from a layman's perspective, it would be worth tracking this data and figuring out the trends and figuring out why this happens. And I'm just kind of curious to know, why aren't we tracking this? Because this sounds pretty important to me.
Well, I think that's another good parallel to the road traffic industry. That is, if you have a speeding ticket or running a stop sign, it may not lead to an accident, and it may not end up in a national or international database, but certainly insurance companies who follow this would look at this and say, well, if this operator keeps running red lights, I'm going to raise their insurance. For all we know, there's something similar going on within the airlines or within the airline industry. Certainly within a major airline, if they have a good handle on the statistics of how they operate the aircraft, they'll be able to point out which flights, which airports, which pilots even tend to be associated with behavior that is outside of acceptable behavior and take action accordingly. But at the same time, they may not have any responsibility to release that information to the public. In other words, it may be taken care of, but not taken care of in a way that you and I will see. And as an aside, I'd like to point something out. At the end of June, I realized something about what happened in the first 6 months of 2017. Worldwide, there was not a single event anywhere in the world where a passenger on a jet airliner died for any reason, not from an accident, not from sabotage, not from military action. I looked back in the records. That had not happened previously until you get to the year 1959. So in spite of the high-profile things that are happening on a regular basis, at the highest level of aviation, I believe that collectively, over time, a lot of good things have been done and have prevented many of the high-level high fatality and even low fatality type events, which when I was younger seemed to be an almost monthly occurrence.
Yeah, I agree, Todd. It's crazy to look back and realize how frequently a plane crash would lead the news. It was something that, as a kid, used to stress me out. I used to have dreams about air crashes, and that's fascinating to learn that we were in that situation. So that was that last year or so far this year, Todd?
So far this year. The first 6 months, 0 passenger fatalities for any sort of jet airliner. And I'll go even further. On my website, airsafe.com, I actually follow a wider range of aircraft, not only jet airliners, but any turboprop airliner that's commonly used in airline service in North America and Western Europe, which means I'm drawing an even wider range of aircraft. And in the past 22 years, in each of the previous 21 years, there was at least one event where there's a passenger death on one of those types of aircraft. Nothing happened this year either.
That's fascinating
stuff. So this is unusual on two levels.
For sure. And so I think that you're right. Obviously, you're the expert, but I have to imagine that it's all this technology that makes these near misses more accessible to the general public. People are talking about them. They have the network to do so and the technology to share their experiences. Before we go here, Todd, I do want to, we had a text message here, somebody suggesting that the crash on the Canary Islands, and I remember this too, 2 Boeing 747 passenger jets colliding on the runway at what was called at the time the Los Rodeos airport on the Canary Islands. 583 people were killed in that aviation accident. Would we have approached a number like this had these 4 or 5 planes collided, 4 on the ground, 1 landing at San Francisco?
The potential was certainly there. I don't know the sizes of the aircraft that were there in San Francisco. Certainly the ones in the Canary Islands, there were 2, I believe, either fully loaded or nearly fully loaded 747s. And all were killed on one aircraft. I think it was a KLM. And most of the people were killed on the Pan Am aircraft. Certainly, depending on what was happening in San Francisco, this would have been in that ballpark. But that's something that I'm happy is only in the realm of speculation.
Todd, thank you for making some time for us today. We greatly appreciate your insight.
Well, thank you once again for having me.
Todd Curtis with us, Air Safe Foundation, and he's aviation expert, formerly worked for Boeing and the American Air Force. Thanks for hooking us up with Todd
Absolutely.
Curtis.
Had him on several times. He's outstanding when it comes to this stuff. I guess the overall message here is simply put, yes, these near hits or near misses, whatever you want to call them, they are scary and they could be disastrous. But the fact is, air travel is still incredibly safe.
I'm sorry that I did not see this text message while we had Todd on the air. Maybe we can send him an email on this, Tristan. Why not use cool blue lights on the taxiway and white lights on the runway?
I wouldn't know the answer to that.
I don't either, but that's why I suggested maybe send it to Todd.
For more information on airline safety and security, please visit airsafe.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.